So with some exciting news regarding Stellar Blade 2 that it's basically been confirmed, after the success of the first game, a sequel felt, well, inevitable, but now it is indeed real. Shift Up says they're developing a follow-up that will keep the fast, stylish action fans loved while expanding the game's world and also improving its gameplay. They also plan to build the franchise further with additional projects in the same universe. Now, it's all about the timing, right? There were rumors that the sequel might be arriving before 2027, at least I wouldn't say that was rumors, it was rumblings, but that, just feels genuinely very much unlikely. The first Stellar Blade released in 2024, a 2, perhaps 3-year turnaround for a full sequel is quite rare today. Realistically, a 2027 or even 2028 release window makes much more sense. Now, I honestly bet on the 2028 as a safe estimate, and even though 4 years is fast compared to many of the AAA teams that take 5 to 7 years between the major titles. So, don't expect a lightning fast follow-up, quality takes time, and this kind of game benefits from a careful development cycle. Now, what should we expect from the sequel? Shift Up says that the game will inherit the original's action-focused design, but will expand the universe and enhance gameplay systems. That's promising. First game combat was a clear highlight, tight, polished, and deeply satisfying. And the sequel should keep that foundation while adding more variety. New enemies, systems, and perhaps deeper combos or movement options. If they focus on refining and expanding combat, they'll preserve what made the first game special. Narrative was the one area many critiques pointed out to. I don't think the first game, I don't think it had a bad story. It just wasn't the most memorable part. The sequel doesn't need to become an hour after an hour cinematic epic to be successful. What would help is a stronger, more coherent story with better pacing and more meaningful characters to work with. Better written dialogue, clearer motivations, and just few well-placed cutscenes can go a long way without turning the game into the cutscenes festival. If Shift Up expands the world through the other media, comics, short stories, or side projects that could deepen lore without forcing every narrative beat into the main game. Now, one big question is how they'll handle the platforms and the publishing. So the first Stellar Blade released on PlayStation and PC, and Sony published the game. If Sony wants to help grow the IP into a PlayStation staple, they might push to publish the sequel too. That could mean timed exclusivity or stronger PlayStation marketing at launch. Shift Up is independent, so the publishing deal will be the key to how broad the initial release is. Given the game's strong performance on PC, I'd like to see a day one PC availability perhaps. But Sony's interest is nurturing big single player titles could shape anything from a timed limited exclusives to wide multi-platform launches. Now, there's also talk of whether Stellar Blade could become a Mascot-like property for the PlayStation, a recognizable character that appears in ads, events, and cross-promotions, if the main character has that potential. Visually striking protagonists often become a brand anchor, and if Shift Up leans into a consistent character design and strong storytelling, it could be one up there with the other memorable PlayStation leads. But becoming a Mascot takes sustained support from both the studio and the publisher across multiple entries and the media. But what about the scope? Shift Up hinted at the expanded universe rather than just a bigger map. That suggests a plan to tell more stories in the same setting. Spin-offs, additional media, or even multiplayer adjacent content. Expanding the IP smartly could keep fans engaged between main entries and let Shift Up explore parts of the world that they didn't fit into the first game. And if they use the sequel to set up those spin-offs, they'll need to balance a strong self-contained sequel story with enough hooks for future projects. Now, performance and visuals are another angle. The first game ran well on I believe it was Unreal Engine 4, while looking stylish, and that's actually quite rare. Shift Up managed to balance visual fidelity and smooth performance, which helped the gameplay feel razor sharp. And for the sequel, players will expect a similar, perhaps even better balance. If they move to a newer engine or heavily upgraded assets, the risk is higher hardware demands. Of course, if we're talking about in this case Unreal Engine 5. Ideally, the sequel will maintain high frame rates and crisp visuals across platforms, especially if it aims to be a flagship title on the next-gen consoles. People also bring up character design and appeal. The first game's lead is visually striking, and yes, the character appeal matters. That doesn't detract from the game's quality. Character design is a legitimate part of the marketing and player connection. Well-designed protagonists help sell the game and bring attention to the mechanics and the story. The key is that the design should complement solid gameplay and a good narrative, not replace them. I'm curious how Shift Up will expand side content and world building. The original could have used more depth in certain areas, but there was a solid base. The sequel can build on that without overcorrecting. More meaningful, perhaps side missions, better NPCs, and environmental storytelling can improve the immersion. New mechanics or systems that add variety to exploration, whether of traversal tools, base upgrades, or non-combat systems, would actually help the world feel larger and more lived in. On the subject of marketing positioning, a 2028 release could line up with the PlayStation 6 window if Sony times it that way. A cross-gen release is also quite possible, which makes sense if Shift Up wants to reach a bigger audience while showcasing the next-gen features later. Whether they choose launching timing and marketing will be crucial. If this becomes one of the Sony's important single-player franchises, expect heavy promotion and possibly a timed exclusive to help sales on PlayStation platforms. In short, the sequel should keep the first game core strengths. Fantastic, responsive combat, strong audio and visual design, and a compelling main character. Improvements to the story structure and world building will go a long way, and expanding the IP with smart tie-ins will help keep interest high between entries. Realistically, don't expect a surprise of 2026 release. Think more closer to 2027, perhaps 2028. With 2028 being a realistic target that gives Shift Up time to polish and expand properly. So that's the update. Stellar Blade 2 is pretty much happening. Development will take a few years, and the studio appears to focus on growing the IP while keeping what players loved about the original. I'm excited to see how they balance the combat and the story in the world expansion. And if they get those parts right, this could become one of the PlayStation standouts for the new franchises, nevertheless. And at that, thank you so much for watching, like and subscribe. I'll see you guys all and have a wonderful day.